All right, welcome to the Discovering Eden podcast. My name is Brandon.
And I'm Jonathan. And you're going to notice a little different change of scenery. Not that you've seen multiple changes of scenery already. We were outside for a little bit, and then we were in another place, and now we're here.
Spice things up a little bit.
Keep you on your toes. But today, we are finishing up our discussion on Narnia, because we definitely didn't get distracted last time.
What? No.
So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. Started with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we're just going to jump right to the end with the last battle. So let's get to
it. Woohoo! All right. So I'm going to give us a little prayer, and then we'll go into the bumper. So let's start up with that. So, dear God, I just thank you that we're able to even use this room in the church, which is free of the cold and everything that's happening outside, which is awesome. And also gives us an opportunity to also include some other guest speakers that would be awesome to incorporate into some of these podcast videos. And just thank you that we're able to go through some of the minds that really we looked forward to and looked up to when we were growing up, with Tolkien, with C.S. Lewis, with all these writers that have influenced us personally. And I think that we're able to approach it with a conversation of faith, that we're able to just listen to each other speak and read and be able to pick up on different aspects that the authors may or may not have wanted us to grasp. So, and just to be able to talk about these things and nerd out about them in whatever way in shape. So I just thank you again and pray this in Jesus' name.
Amen. Let's do this. So Narnia, the last battle.
Last dab.
Did you say stab or dab?
No, the last dab.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're thinking of different things. I appreciated your input.
Oh, darn.
Last Battle was the final book of the Chronicles of Narnia. It's also one of my personal favorites in the series. And spoiler alert, it talks about the end of days in Narnia.
The end times. Narnia has to end, unfortunately. Both the book series
and the world.
And the world.
But the book begins with a very interesting character. I guess characters. Because it's plural.
Yeah.
We meet Shift, the ape, and Puzzle, the donkey. And Shift is described as kind of clever. And that's not meant as a positive. It's meant as in a negative.
It's more shrewd.
Shrewd.
Yeah.
He's kind of sneaky, a little bit of a villain. And Puzzle, being the donkey.
Confused.
Puzzle. A little goofy. Not always all there. And Shift finds...
putting the pieces together.
One step at a time, he'll finish that 1,000-piece puzzle.
You know, to be honest, when I thought of, Puzzle, I thought of, Eeyore.
Oh, really?
So, Winnie the Pooh, Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. That's kind of the picture I got. Now, I didn't actually read The Last Battle, but I did skim and was able to kind of pick up on some of the characteristics and everything. Sure. And he's he calls himself the Fool, kind of different things like that. But it's he gives Eeyore. Kind of woe is me.
I'm too dumb to live.
Yeah.
It is interesting that C.S. Lewis chose an ape and a donkey. I mean, it's very symbolic. Let's be real. But suffice it to say, Shift finds a lion's skin and decides to sew a coat for his good friend Puzzle. his friend.
His good friend.
And Puzzle is initially kind of reluctant. He's like, well, what if I look like Aslan? That wouldn't be ideal. But Shift plays off like, I made this coat for you. You're really gonna reject a gift from a friend? Very kind of deceptive in that.
Yeah.
He knows how to get to Puzzle.
He's got the pieces together.
He doesn't have the right pieces together.
Yeah.
But he's got some sort of pieces, and they're there.
Not the pieces that he's like square peg, circle hole.
No, that's Puzzle.
Yeah, that's true.
Shift is just putting together the wrong puzzle. It's an evil puzzle.
Yeah, evil puzzle.
So if you haven't caught on yet, Shift is our antagonist, or at least one of them. And there's some symbolism there, some allegory there. I would argue he's kind of like the Antichrist figure that you would see in Revelation with his deception of the Narnians.
Like for me, I would say like Shift is more like the false prophet.
Okay, interesting.
And then the Antichrist would be Puzzle.
Mm.
Though Puzzle doesn't actually know what's going on.
Yeah.
But the brains behind it is Shift.
See, and that's where, I feel like you can make
an argument,
either connection there, because I feel like Shift falls more into a category with either of them. Puzzle is more just you're clueless. I'm here.
He's just a figurehead, really.
That's really what it is.
Yeah.
Because he does don the lion suit and becomes a fake
in my opinion, it's like almost like the false prophet does all the speaking.
He's the mouthpiece.
And the Antichrist is just a figurehead. Now
that's a really good way to put it, though.
Though, is that actually what it's like in the Bible? Is that actually how it's going to go? I have no idea.
But again, I mean, this is
it's an interpretation, and that was my interpretation of Shift and Puzzle.
And I think that's actually a really interesting point that graced over me. But looking back on the book, and you see the moments at the stable.
Yeah.
When nightfall has come, they can't really tell who Puzzle is. They think he's Aslan because lion suit.
Yep.
But Puzzle doesn't do any of the speaking, really. It's all Shift.
Shifting attention,
exactly.
Doing all that.
Hey, you guys have to cut down the trees, and I'm going to take the profits because Aslan says to. Like, that's his first, major,
That's why I view Shift as more of...
I think that's a fair point.
The false prophet.
I'm going to retract my statement. Yeah. I'm going to agree with you.
Which, I mean, obviously most of the bad comes from him.
Right.
In
fact, I think Puzzle does make it into true Narnia.
He does make it into true Narnia because...
of an act of repentance in the end.
He's like, I'm sorry.
I made an oopsie.
I lost my tail, but...
We do not know how to be good.
I'm so dumb, I don't understand.
We need to, input donkey noises every time Shift or Puzzle does something stupid.
I'm sorry.
Hee-haw, hee-haw.
My bad.
All right.
Anyways.
Where was
another thing that I kind of thought of, and I think C.S. Lewis meant this as well, is especially with the donkey and the lion's mane, is like a direct echo to Aesop's fable, which is the donkey and the lion skin.
We won't use the real.
We won't use the actual other name for the donkey, but it kind of again shows that deception kind of thing as well. Exactly. So that obviously it's a bit more in your face in that aspect.
I think The Last Battle alongside Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe are the most in your face of the Narnia books.
And then another thing that I thought was interesting is that in the book, Shift describes himself as a man.
Well, it's interesting because he becomes more... C.S. Lewis describes it as he becomes less ape-like and more human as the book continues. He becomes more deceptive, as though he's facing this transformation. The more villainous he becomes, the more he begins to deceive the Narnians. They start perceiving him as less of an ape and more of a person. Yeah. More of a... It's interesting.
Which, especially considering everything, it kind of gave like wolf in sheep's clothing kind of aspect, except on the humanity side of things, especially looking at it in our own lives. Like, okay, what is like quote unquote science look at humanity as? Oh, well, they evolved from monkeys, apes, different things.
And I always wondered,
and it's just like I think it's intentional.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
why he's an ape.
well, that's what I was
Yeah.
gonna say. Is I always had to wonder when I was reading it as a kid or as a teenager or whatever. That had to be intentional on C.S. Lewis's part, just that little.
And even the donkeys make an appearance in the Bible.
Quite a lot.
In quite a like you have Balaam and you have different things, but the one I specifically, specifically the like puzzle gives Balaam
Okay.
and the talking donkey, like that whole story. That's what kind of spoke out to me because he was like basically speaking against the person that wanted to curse
Right.
like the other believers of God. And basically the donkey, which was given voice by God, was like, bro, not a good idea. And then even for like the cluelessness of puzzle, I mean, not to say that Balaam's master and everything like there was confused in the whole situation. Now I don't know if this is necessarily fitting of anything, but I thought of the donkey that Jesus rode into
I was
town.
just thinking that myself.
They're like, hey, go and get this donkey that's tied up somewhere, and I'm gonna ride it into town. Just think of what the donkey's thinking. What? Or it was a mule or something, right? But
the idea is, it's kind of this animal that nobody would think much of.
Well, it's also a beast of burden, which I think is also
very interesting.
Another thing to note, and taking on a lot of things. So in this aspect, puzzle is also taking on the moniker and visage of
Aslan.
Aslan, or fake Aslan, as they call it in the book, or Tashlan.
Which we'll get into the whole Tash thing in a moment, because that's another.
But so those are just some of the things that came into my mind. Obviously, I never actually read like in depth the book, but I did enough superficial. I mean, it's superficial.
Digging.
So yeah, I did a little digging.
He's been mining for information all week.
Mining for little nuggets. The geologist in me.
Off to work we go. Oh, we're gonna get copyright strike for that.
Oh no. Another thing that I thought was interesting. Now, I didn't read The Magician's Nephew, but what I found online is Narnia started in a garden and ended in a garden.
Yeah.
Which reminds me kind of the Garden of Eden. So it starts in the Garden of Eden. Obviously, we do not know the end, but it's when Eden becomes...
Yeah. Well, I guess let's briefly touch on like what the end of Narnia at least looks like. C.S. Lewis's interpretation of the end of the world. So I have the beautiful, wonderful Wikipedia plot synopsis pulled up right now for reference.
Yes, I did glance at that as well.
Yes,
but I wanted to look at other sources as well.
Yeah, this is for the sake of me pulling this out.
Of simplicity.
The sake of simplicity, just so I have something to reference. But Aslan brings all the believers into the stable, into basically the new Narnia, which we know of. But then the Narnia that you read about in the books, we see that Father Time, another legendary figure, is awoken, and he calls the stars down from the sky, which again, very interesting.
Very Revelation-esque.
Yep. We see all the inhabitants of Narnia judged outside the stable by Aslan.
Yeah.
And again, Narnia is this world of talking animals and beasts.
And even going to some of that, like something that I was reading as well, is basically the salamanders, the dragons, and everything were breathing fire, burned down,
destroying
the forest, and then rotted to corpses and stuff like that afterward. And obviously, there's dragons in Revelation
Yep.
that are mentioned. Specifically, one dragon that's mentioned, which has its own illustration.
But it is
as to what
interesting
it is.
that the Book of Revelation, the dragon is obviously a destructive force. You see it here; they're still destructive forces. I mean, maybe that's just prototypical of dragons in general, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
Now,
Might
in
be
my
interesting.
story, dragons are like both good and
I would say
evil.
the same. I mean,
Because I love dragons. I love the idea of them. You'll get to some of the reasoning of some of that in when we talk about our own stories. But I also wanted to go into like one of the other studies that I personally did of Revelation 1 and kind of go into a deep dive
yeah.
into some of that, dragons being part of it, which is more inspired by the last battle here. And we'll get into, because another series that I want to do is on creatures in the Bible.
See, that'd be kind of fun.
So you got your behemoth, you have Leviathan, you have all these other creatures, and I'd argue same with dinosaurs and dragons and all that kind of stuff. Because they're in myth, sure, but you have giants, you have all these things that still end up in the Bible, and just taking a deeper look at some of those.
And what does that mean?
And what does it mean?
Yeah.
And it's also interesting, especially for Revelation, the book of Revelation. Was written during the time of Roman occupation.
Yeah.
Draconis, all those kind of things. Those would have been terms that were used. Dragon was never used in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Why? Because it wasn't coined yet. Same with dinosaur. Wasn't coined yet. That was like 18 something that it was coined. So, again, taking a look at some of these different things and some of the studies I've personally done and taking a look at it. But that's another series. That's another one of the things I nerd out about because I love that kind of stuff.
For sure.
But anyway.
But yeah, I mean, so you've got the judgment, we've got the dragons, as you mentioned, but then we see the ocean and the seas rise over Narnia. And then Father Time puts out the sun and everything freezes over. And we see King Peter close the door to the stable. And that's it. That's the end. They go, Aslan leads them off into what's called Aslan's country. But it is
Narnia.
True Narnia. Exactly. It's the final paradise, the whatever you want to call it. Heaven.
If you want to call it.
But I think the what always stood out to me, and maybe it was the image that was illustrated in the book of that, whether it was the last chapter or final couple chapters, I don't remember, but that heading image was the image of the ocean freezing over in the version that I had.
Okay.
And it's such a desolate image. And I don't know why that it's just something has stuck with me. And I'm not sure if it's just that desolation of the end, of that this is it. I don't know.
Honestly, it kind of reminds me of like the phrase like, "Oh, I won't believe it until hell freezes over."
For sure.
And that's almost what it gives, like kind of things. It would have been funny if you also had a pig fly. But obviously that has nothing to do with anything.
Speaking of Winnie the Pooh, Piglet.
Yo, Piglet, you got your wings. I had Red Bull.
This episode is definitely getting copyright struck. It's been a good run.
And then something that was interesting, again, especially with the ending of the book.
Yeah.
Especially with Lucy, with Peter, with
Eustace, Jill,
Diggory,
Polly. Those ones.
Yep, the 7 of them. So, spoiler warning for anybody who has not read the books.
Okay, including Brandon. He's about to be spoiled.
Well, I spoiled myself, really, but give it a little bit.
I read the books, but I still don't want to be spoiled, so I'm just gonna.
Oh, okay. So at the end, they actually they died. Choo choo.
That was dark.
Wow. Okay.
Yikes.
So
I'm gonna just let myself
actually,
out.
how they ended up getting into Narnia was their train in the real world crashing
Yes.
with them
On it.
dying.
Very dark ending to
which, especially since it ends on more of a happy note, as in you're in paradise now.
yeah.
Like you're in true Narnia, because Aslan was both in Narnia, but also in
Well, it even tells you in the book
yeah.
that he sheds his lion skin
Yeah,
in the end.
because then he. Yeah.
I mean, the
it's
implication
very.
is
Its implication is it's Jesus.
yes.
So. Yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, children's book, like, and I was reading online. People were like,
It was a very controversial.
it was a
move.
very controversial end because here's your protagonists for like most of the series. Oh yeah, they all died.
Happily ever after.
They died happily ever after.
But what's also funny is the final line of the book, and again, it's one that sticks with you. But the quote is, "It's just the beginning of the story, which goes on forever and ever, and every chapter is better than the last."
Yeah.
Which is such a interesting final line.
Well, because again, to me, that ties to the Book of Revelation.
Yes.
And why do we not have other books in the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
It's because it's continuously being written.
Right.
So, obviously not written in the sense that it's in the Bible.
Right.
But life still happens. Life's still going on. So that's kind of what it tied in for me, at least.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Let's briefly touch on, because I do want to get into Tash, but I also I don't want to forget about our good friends, the dwarves, because I think there's a very interesting little theological thing there. And the idea is the dwarves they're obviously Narnians, but their whole shtick, the entire book, is the dwarves are for the dwarves, sort of thing. Like, they're just fighting for themselves. They could care less who wins the war.
They just see the gold and they're like, money signs.
And these goofy little guys, they end up in the stable, but they don't get devoured by Tash, who, again, we'll talk about. But they also don't realize they're in Aslan's country. They think they're still locked in the stable.
They just think they're in a stable. They're like...
And the whole thing is, because it's mentioned by the characters that, do they even realize what's going on? No, they don't. And I don't remember the exact quote, and I've been trying to find it. I mean, Brandon can speak to that. But it's something along the lines of their faith it wasn't there. But I still find it interesting that they're still technically in Aslan's country, and I'm not sure. I want to dive a little bit into what the implication is there.
Yeah,
because it's very odd.
Because especially with like Susan and Susan not being in Narnia, different things like that, which definitely is interesting. But I think even the dwarves being there and like referencing the Last Judgment or Judgment Day, you're gonna be in there. Regardless if you believe or not. What happens afterward?
Well, that's the thing.
Like, everything's kind of like, who knows?
Well, yeah, and they're there.
They're there.
They don't realize they're there.
Yeah.
And that's the part that I think is so bizarre to me. It's this.
It makes me think of like imagine yourself at the end of your time on Earth.
Okay.
So what happens when you die? Where do you go? What do you see?
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that would say, well, that's the end. That's the end. You see black.
It's over.
The end.
But then you've also got...
There's people that think, oh, well, there's Judgment Day. There's all this stuff.
There's an afterlife.
So they're seeing all these things like that they're picturing in their mind. But what about those people that don't believe? What would they see? Would they see that empty stable? Would they just be lost? Would they not have any idea what's happening? Without being able to see because they don't believe? How does that look like? And I think this is kind of C.S. Lewis's way of kind of introducing this kind of question.
Because that was this whole thing.
But it still leaves things up for discussion and different things that who knows.
And I think another, I don't want to rush through the dwarf thing, but I do, another interesting theological question that C.S. Lewis raises, and maybe this one was a little more controversial, is that character of Emeth
Yeah.
in the books, who was a member, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation here, but the
Calmarellians?
Calmarenians,
Something.
I don't know.
Calories.
Basically the antagonistic faction in the book. And he was a soldier who he makes it into Aslan's country, which in of itself I don't find super odd because it, you know, the idea that somebody, you know, turns good. But the way C.S. Lewis phrases it, I think is where maybe there might be a little pushback.
Yeah.
Because the idea is this guy Emeth is super faithful to the Calmarinian god of Tash, who is the personification of evil. And the idea is that, well, he does only, he serves Tash by doing good deeds, good things. But because Tash is evil, those good things can't be done in his name, and they're done in Aslan's name anyway, so he's in Aslan's country. And I think that is a very complicated little...
It's something that it's like... It's definitely controversial.
Yes.
Because it's like, can you still do good and be... Well, like, it's basically, can you still go to, like, heaven even if you were serving the enemy kind of thing?
Yeah, well, and you never actually, you know, come to this place of repentance. And again, I mean, C.S. Lewis phrases it that, well, he was doing good. He was doing good deeds. But good can't be done in Tash's name. But that's why I think it's so controversial and so bizarre.
Yeah, and it almost ties me of, like, good works can save you, which is not the case.
It is the one... Because there's a lot that C.S. Lewis has written that I really agree with. I think he's a great theologian.
It's the one that it's like...
It's where I have pushback.
Yeah, it's pushback. And I don't want to say that's because of his influence with Tolkien.
No.
But it's that idea of doing good and,
you know, having that good karma will come back for you, sort of thing.
And it's that there's definitely pushback, because I read that as well, and I'm like, I don't know about that one.
And again, it's not that, you know, a villainous character, because I wouldn't even argue that, because Emeth isn't written as a villainous character, but somebody of the villainous faction. It's not an unrecognizable concept that they could redeem themselves. We see that all the time throughout fiction. It's the way that it's done that I've always wrestled with.
Yeah.
Because it's one of the few things that I don't really know if I agree with C.S. Lewis's theology there. It seems to go against a lot of, you know, what I've been taught, you know, what I've learned, what I've studied. Yeah.
And then kind of looking at the last battle in and of itself. So obviously it kind of encapsulates the book of Revelation as we kind of see it in the Bible. And by going off of that basis, there are certain things that stood out to me as I was looking at it. So the number 7, obviously important. And that's the number of people that re-entered Narnia. Yeah,
the Friends of Narnia.
So the Friends of Narnia, as it was called. And that's not Susan. So 7... because
if you remember from our discussion from last week, Susan isn't there. Now, can you describe just to the audience, what is the importance of the number 7, at least from a theological, biblical, you know?
So 7 is a holy number. And also termed perfection in Hebrew, like counting. It's known for perfection. Especially as the 7th day is holy because God made it holy because it's his day of rest.
Yes.
Or the day of rest. So that's why Sabbath is holy. It's just that finality, perfection kind of thing.
And that was theology with Brandon.
But it's because of that, it reminded me of something I actually did in seminary.
I'm excited to hear this.
So it's definitely a whole lot deeper and theological, scholarly sounding. So I'll probably get little snapshots of it. I almost just want to go through the whole thing because I go through a lot. But it's specifically Revelation 1:12 through 16 that I'd like to give focus to. And I'm going to read that first before I go into some of the things that
What's the verses one more time, just so I can
So
get it.
Revelation 1:12 through 16.
Okay.
And I am reading this from the NRSVUE.
And what version is that, just for the viewers?
Yeah, I don't remember the name of it. You can look at NIV too. It doesn't matter. Like,
All right.
yeah, Bible Gateway, look stuff up. Yeah. I had to do it with this specific version in this
For
class, so that's what it's
He's
from.
a seminary student, just
Almost done. December. We're almost there. Some of you may even be watching because I mentioned it in class. So hi. That's my buddy Jonathan.
All right. Let's see what you got.
So obviously when we look at like the Chronicles of Narnia, different things, there's all these animals and creatures that come up, like centaurs, minotaurs,
Kind of those mythological.
all those mythological things, which reminds me of the Roman context or Greek context that I think John was also writing in the book of Revelation. So here, let me expound a little bit on this. So besides, obviously, the New Testament books were written in Greek. So as opposed to Hebrew, which was the Old Testament. So they're written in Greek, and John's writing to not just a Hebrew audience. He's writing it to anyone whom it may concern. And it is his revelation that he has. And I think speaks to everyone hearing it. And especially, it was written for the people of that time, but as we look at it now, kind of paints a different picture of what we can see. Because to us, it'd be like, what the heck is happening?
Revelation is it's
a deep book. It's a very deep book. And I'll try to explain a couple of things, at least that I've looked at
For sure.
upon looking scripture in my own journey and my own looking and diving deep into some of these things. And it ties into some of the different gods and goddesses that you find in Greek mythology.
Sure.
So, and just a little bit of context. John's writing this on the island of Patmos.
And he was in exile, right?
In exile. And it kind of reminded me of the mountain of the gods, Mount Olympus, which was also an island near the same area in the Aegean Sea.
I just had another thought about the last battle. I'll save it because it's interesting, but you sparked a thought.
Exactly. This is why I was drawn to it, because it reminded me so much of this study that I did.
Yeah.
So there's parallel there against, again, Mountain of the Gods. So to put in perspective, everything that he will talk about is pertaining to the gods and who resides over top of all of it. So, and I'm going to read it as follows. So, Revelation 1:12-16 goes as follows. Then I turned to see whose voice it was that spoke to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, I saw one like the Son of Man, clothed with a long robe and a golden sash across his waist. His head and his hair were white as white wool, white as snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined as in a furnace. And his voice was like the sound of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword. and his face was like the face was like the sun shining with full force. So that's the passage. And obviously, there's a lot of things in there that Hebrews would have been like, oh, this is what he's referencing. So there are many descriptors that stood out to me as I read the passage, trying to relate to several cultures to the best of my ability. The 7 golden lampstands are likely a reference to the 7 golden lamps of the tabernacle, written in Exodus 25, 31 through 40. And it illuminates Jesus as God and as a light that never ends. As the golden lamps were to be lit with olive oil so they may keep burning from evening till morning for generations to come, is what it says in the book of Exodus. And the Son of Man is Jesus, but different attributes of him that follow depicts a different Greek/Roman god or goddess, which is the interesting part. Signifying that God holds authority over all and commands all aspects that the Greek and Roman goddesses and gods controlled. The golden sash could be a reference to Jason and the Argonauts, which come from a golden flying ram that was sacrificed to Zeus. Again, ram is another interesting factoid there.
Oh, for sure.
But I'll go beyond that. So Jesus is often referred to as the sacrificial lamb, even for us today, which I think is of no coincidence considering the massive role shepherding plays in Hebraic and Middle Eastern culture, and the fact that it still appears in the book of Revelation, which is more on the Mediterranean side, so Rome and just the Roman Empire, but that contains the Middle East at this point in time. So then going into the different aspects of what Jesus' descriptors, let's say. So the head and the hair being as white as snow is a reference, could be a reference to the Greek god Chronos, the god of time. Mm-hmm. Again, ties into the Father Time aspect in Narnia. The fact that white wool and white as snow is mentioned leads me to think of the Lamb of God being slain for the sins of all, yet also reminds me of prophecy given in Isaiah 1, 18 through 20, which reads, "Come now, let us settle the matter, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, shall be as white as snow. Though they are as red as crimson, they shall be like wool. If you are willing and obedient, you'll eat the good things of the land, but if you resist and rebel, you will be devoured by the sword. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken." Now, Chronos in Greek mythology, or Roman, or I can't really recall at the time, had white hair. Now, is that a little bit of a stretch? Maybe a little bit, but the time aspect is kind of what I'm alluding to.
It's a little on the nose.
It's the white hair focuses on time. So God has authority over time. So Jesus is ahead of time. And then continuing the descriptors. The eyes of fire could be a reference to the Greek titan Prometheus, who was a god of fire and associated with the creation of mortals. Again, the flyer of life.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of these different things. So the creation story comes to mind, obviously, with this. And then with the bronze, the burnished bronze, makes me think of the Greek god of Hephaestus, who forged Talos made of bronze to protect Europa, protector as another thing. And also what Jews would have picked up on, or Hebrews, would have been brought up of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace during the Bronze Age. Or, different things where, like, the statue was made of, like, a bronze and different thing. And it alludes to the vision and everything that, Nebuchadnezzar had. Yeah. All that kind of stuff. which is in Daniel 2, Daniel 3. Then the rushing waters could have been Poseidon, the Greek god Poseidon, which controlled the waters, and his name meaning Lord of the Earth. So, and obviously I go into different things, and then there's the 7 stars. Could be related to Astraeus, the Titan Astraeus, who is the god of the stars and planets, who created the stars. So again, it adds that authority, power, and over everything here. And then obviously you have the shining face, which Jews would have recognized as Moses, with his face shining by being in his presence. Also, you look at any picture that you see relating to the iconography of like Jesus, you see a halo. What is that halo from? Well, it's actually from the Greek god Helios, which was from like the pantheon or whatever. When the sunlight would come in at a certain time, would shine up, and then that somehow got infused in the iconography. So some of these things are tied in, which makes it very interesting from taking a look at it from a revelation standpoint, and like seeing it, but also seeing it in the culture and context that you're in. So like in the thing for Chronicles of Narnia, for example. So you have minotaurs, you have all these different creatures and everything. Then you got Tash, and you have different things like that. So later in the book of Revelation, you have the dragon, the lady and the dragon. So there's a lot of these things. And again, you have Draco and like all that kind of stuff with Roman and Greek mythology as well, because Romans took a lot of Greek mythology and they're like, let's just give them new names.
It's ours now.
It's ours. We took this over. But it's just different things that it reminded me of.
Yeah.
And what C.S. Lewis, I think, does a very good job at doing is tying in these different aspects and different like imagery to different things that affect the world of Narnia, but also of our own reality in and of itself.
Now, do you think that was, just to kind of pose the question, do you think that was, because we talked about this a little bit last week, and why he was hesitant to call it an allegory because of the, pagan, representation. Do you think that was intentional, or do you think he was just like, minotaurs are cool?
Well,
or could it be a little bit of,
it could be a little bit of both. Like, I'd argue, like, here would be like my pushback question to that is, would you say that the book of Revelation is allegory?
That is a great question. And so, I would say, I think, based on, what I did in school, we always referred to it as apocalyptic literature.
Yes.
It's not meant to necessarily be interpreted as this is literally what's going to happen. It is more, I would say, more symbolic and an allegory of what's to come.
Which is why it is also such a deep book, because a lot of the other books of the Bible, I think, are meant to be read more literally.
Oh, for sure.
Which, again, is more of a controversial thing to other people as well.
We can do another episode on that.
There's plenty of things that we could talk about. But, like, again, it comes to some of my background, being a geologist, like age of the earth. Is the creation of the earth, was it 7 actual days as we know them, or is it 7 chunks of time? What is it? I mean, at the grand scheme of things, does it really matter? No, not really.
But it's an interesting thing to
But
think
it's
about.
an interesting thing to ponder, whether it's more metaphorical, more literal. Obviously, not necessarily literally in some instances. Like, I'm not going to bring up some right now, but just in some of those things. But that's kind of what I was somewhat reminded of.
Yeah.
Especially, like, you look at the 7 kids, or, well, they were kids by the time they went into Narnia.
Now they're adults, obviously.
They're a little bit more older. But that's relating to, like, the 7 churches. So like 7 foundations,
Sure.
let's say. And so they're like essentially the 7 founders of Narnia. They're the kings and queens of old that they talk about in their lore and all these different things. Like, because Diggory was right at the beginning.
Him and Polly, and then
And
you
Polly.
had Heaven Seas, and then you had Eustace
Then
and Jill.
Yep.
And I
So
do believe...
it spans the whole length of Narnia. And again, another thing that is the 7 stars refer to the 7 angels, or whether it was the lampstands or angels, whatever. This 7 still applies, but it makes me think of the lampstands, especially for the kids, because it's for generations to come. That caught my attention because there's generations that happen throughout Narnia, and the couple of the key children, I'll just generalize them as children or friends in Narnia, that happen scattered throughout, and being more of a solid foundation, writing the path to going back to, almost made me think of like almost Judges to some degree, of let's bring it back, because we're going off kilter, we're going off the rails a little bit, especially with like say Prince Caspian a little bit, where things were kind of going, Narnians were losing their faith and different things like that, or you have the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, different things like that. And obviously those are entire books on their own, but summing up,
it is an interesting thought though, and an interesting thing to consider. I did have an interesting thought, and it's not, it was when you were talking about, the exile of John.
Yeah.
Because I was, kind of skimming the book throughout the week, and it was something that didn't stand out to me then, but the minute you said exile, Padnos, revelation, it was his revelation. I was like, holy cow, C.S. Lewis, I think he did something with that. In regards to King Tyrion, who is kind of the main protagonist of the story. So he gets when he kind of lashes out against the tax land sort of thing, and he realizes it's a facade. They tie him up and they lock him away, and he calls on Aslan. What does he get? A revelation from King Peter, a vision. It's just he's in exile in this moment.
Yeah, he gets his own revelation.
Yeah, it was something, because I was just reading the summary today again, and I was that's kind of cool. And then you said that, I was like, holy cow.
It's different aspects of that really reminded me of the first chapter in Revelation.
Such a little...
Because it really stands out, at least to me, especially with everything that's in it, including like the different descriptors of Aslan and using Father Time and using all these other things.
Too, to even just discuss it, because you pick up on a lot of like the blatant things that are in your face. That's not something that's necessarily in your face.
It's not in your face, but
I think it's intentional.
I think a lot of this stuff is intentional.
Yeah.
Including like something like the Turkish Delight that I brought up last week.
Yeah, you made it before we started recording.
I even like did a little bit of extra research because I didn't actually know where Turkish Delight originated. Guess where it originated? Constantinople.
Brandon nailed it.
The Ottoman Empire, Constantinople, that kind of thing, and that's where it originated. Which is another really interesting thing. I think that was intentional.
I think so too. And it's not something that, again, that I necessarily thought of until we discussed it.
And it's a little easy to miss.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is.
There's a lot of those things that I think are intentionally placed. And I'm saying this from a perspective of an author that likes to put little nuggets scattered in the midst of the story.
And that's what's so fun about discussing these stories. And I'm sure we're going to find things with Lord of the Rings when we get to that too. Where there's going to be things where you look at you can find, the little nuggets that are obvious.
Yes, there's obvious things.
But it's when you start digging deeper and you start talking about it, you're just... There goes the light bulb. What did Lewis do? What did Tolkien do? what are these things that they...
And I think we'll find as we talk about these things, there's a lot of some similarities that we'll see because they talk to each other. They were
buddies.
They were buddies for the time they like hung out and did all the Inklings and all that kind of stuff. Like they went and shared a lot of what they were going, like what they written and what kind of stood out to them, which is again kind of with the Grima Worm Tongue Screw Tape Letters thing, which Tolkien very much could have been influenced by the Screw Tape Letters.
I wouldn't be surprised
on
if he
writing
wasn't.
Grima Worm Tongue's person.
Maybe something to do a little research on before we get into that.
I mean, there was like a 10-year-ish gap, a little bit over that, of when Screw Tape Letters was published and the publication of Lord of the Rings. So during that time, he definitely could have included that in his work. I mean, I know how long it's taken me to write a book, and it's taken a little bit longer than that, but I mean, considering I'm still writing the first installation of the series that I have in mind.
He's going to get the first one down, and then the rest are going to be, bam, bam,
Hey,
bam, bam, bam.
It starts with one. As soon as I can get one done and have a good foundation, I think I can just sail from that point onward. Because I have an idea of what I want to do. But again, that's
different topic.
Different topic. We'll get to that eventually. But yeah, it's... So some of these things, like... And I didn't even read The Last Battle. I skimmed through it because I have it at home. I skimmed through it, looked at the couple of the key chapters, and just took a look at some of this stuff. And it's some of these little tiny details that stick out to me, and why that passage in Revelation stood out to me. Obviously, I didn't go word for word what was on my paper, because it goes way theologically in the weeds and scholarly and heady, and honestly, I feel like people would kind of lose interest because it's so dense. Because it gets dense, and I do a little bit of research and different. Well, I mean, and the funny thing is, how I even know some of these Greek gods and some of what they do is because of anime, funny enough. So, like Don Machi, for example, like Hephaestus, I learned from Don Machi. And then looked it up later, and then I'm like, oh wow, that actually makes sense. Like, so all these kind of things, I'm like, I actually learned some of these from like cultured stuff that makes no sense, that doesn't really apply. But then you have other instances like Jason and the Argonauts, you have the Iliad, like Odyssey, different things like this that also lend to some of that. And we'll get into some of that later with like the creatures, because I really want to do that, because I had that,
put it out on the schedule.
I had that as part of like the creation series, but I think I want to make it its own series.
1 week on Leviathan, 1 week on Behemoth.
Yeah, because it's really interesting. I've always kind of been interested in that cryptozoology kind of vein. Not necessarily saying, oh, these things existed. Like, for example, I'll just give you a brief little prelude to what some of this is. So, a dragon. What is a dragon? So, medieval understanding of what a dragon is would be, your big lizard with wings.
Breathes fire.
Breathes fire. Chinese dragon, very different.
Yes.
More serpent-like. Again, we'll get to
Almost
serpent.
more regal too.
More regal, and is very much associated with water. The opposite of fire.
Yeah.
So it's another interesting take there, and they're totally opposite ends of the world. So that's another aspect of that. But something that came to mind for me is in the book of Genesis. What's the thing that deceived Adam and Eve?
The serpent.
The serpent. But what does God do to the serpent to basically condemn him? You're forbidden from walking on your legs and slithering on the ground. Huh. Interesting. ... That's just a little prelude, but another thing is I mean, and I thought of this kind of when C.S. Lewis was describing his dragons with like bat-like wings.
Mm-hmm.
How do we view demons?
As little horn monstrosities.
Horns monstrosity with bat-like wings.
You know, the pointy tail. You know,
It's a dragon, so to speak.
Interesting.
Which, again, alludes to the dragon in the book of Revelation, which is the devil. Which is an interesting take. Now, obviously, this is a prelude. I'll get into some of the things. I like dragons in and of themselves in the medieval form. But I think what they're talking about is actually dinosaurs at that point.
Mm.
And it's the different amalgamations of things. Now, what the dragon in Chinese mythology, that's interesting. And that's what I've been recently doing some research into. So we'll get there when we get there. But that's again, a prelude to some of that stuff.
You can look forward to it.
I really like some of that stuff. Obviously, I am no expert when it comes to these things.
Brandon's a cryptozoologist. He's
So, again, it's called the Nerd Corner. This thing up here, we're nerds. We nerd out. So, that'll be one of the topics. I'm excited for that topic when we get to it. Obviously, following weeks, we'll be talking about the Lord of the Rings. Whether that's a 1 episode or 2, we'll find out.
It'll depend on how long it takes us. Narnia was supposed to be 1. We split it into 2 because we talked too much.
Well, we like The Last Battle, and yeah.
We're ramblers. Let's be real.
We're definitely rattlers. Not the snake variety. Yeah, so that's just a little snapshot into C.S. Lewis, and then next week we'll get into Tolkien, which I like Tolkien. I like his stuff. However, as we'll get into next week, wasn't necessarily looked as favorable on as C.S. Lewis was. His Oxford colleagues favored C.S. Lewis's work over Tolkien's.
Which is, again, and we can talk about this later, but I would say Tolkien's works, at least now,
outshine.
Yes,
C.S.
for most
Lewis,
people
yes.
at least.
So, and we'll get into a little bit of that. I did a little research on both Lewis and Tolkien, so we'll kind of do that. And it's kind of interesting to look at some of the authors that I kind of looked up to and inspired some of the things that I'm writing. Obviously, I feel like they did a better job at it because, well, they were the pioneers of it. They knew kind of what they were doing. Not to say that I don't know what I'm doing, but it's not in the same vein, we'll say. My character speaking is lacking. I could do imagery just fine. It's the dialogue and back and forth between some of the characters that could use some tweaking. But anyway, I think that'll be it for this video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff.
And we'll see you next time.
And we'll see you next time. Maybe in the
Signing
same
off.
room.
Probably in the same room.
Well, all right, cut it. Ah!